Happy Father's Day to the fathers out there. I hope you had a delightful day so far, that your children jumped on you first thing in the morning, just as mine did for me, or if your children are much larger, maybe that's less comfortable still. I was spending some time with the kids yesterday with my father-in-law, and was making these little, the little chatterbox things. I made a little chatterbox thing and filled it with some good quality dad jokes for them, like what did the left say? Like, what did the left eye say to the right eye? Between you and me, something smells. And my kids cacked themselves, and I was like, I think this is like a stage, like a glorious stage of fatherhood, where your kids actually think you're funny, and gives you a false sense of security for the future, really, where it just kind of, they realise you're not funny, and then it's all downhill from there. But you've gained your confidence by that point, and you just keep on going strong. So, not my sermon this morning, but message to start with to the fathers: just keep going strong. It's worthwhile. We all have different people in our lives that are kind of like father figures, and maybe it is a actual biological father, maybe it's a stepfather, maybe it's adopted father, maybe it's just a father figure, someone in your life. And different ones of us play that kind of different role as well, different mentors, influences in people's lives. And your experience of fatherhood and your thoughts on fatherhood generally will differ depending on what kind of those experiences are. But there is some great people, I'm sure, that in different people's lives that have poured into you in different ways. We're going to jump into this passage that we've just read in John 15, and we're going to see this time where Jesus is really pouring into the lives of his disciples. John 15 is it's kind of Jesus in John. It's Jesus' last kind of teaching before he's separated from his disciples. It's the day, the night before he dies. And so this teaching that he's doing here in John 15, when the sun sets that evening, Jesus is going to be arrested and he will be taken away. And before the sun sets again, he'll have already died and be put in a tomb. So that's kind of the scenario that's here. And you can see, as we read this, you can see this pouring out of Jesus to his disciples, this desperation for them to last kind of opportunity. He's going to rise again. He knows that he's got more teaching to give them. But as he prepares them, at least for these next 3 days, to think about what it means to be a faithful follower. But the message he tells them in John 15 is not just a message for them for the next 3 days, but for followers for the future. What does it mean to be a faithful follower? And so we're going to spend a bit of time in that this morning, and we think about fruitfulness and what it looks like to be a fruitful follower. In fact, for the fathers, we might think about what it looks like to be a fruitful father, but for all of us this morning, we want to think about what it means to be a fruitful follower of Jesus. And we get some of that in this message that he gives them about fruit, right? We get these very clear pictures of fruit and fruitfulness. And I want to start with this. I want to start with being fruitful follower begins in the source, right? It begins with our identity is in Jesus. He is the source of fruitfulness. There's a great temptation in life to think about and put our identity into different things. Temptation for us to put our identity in things other than Jesus, different things. I don't know what it is you kind of, when you think, what defines me? Who am I? We often jump to things like what I do for a living, what my family is. We might think about some of our character makeup. Some of that I find is like those first conversations you have with someone when you're getting to know them and you're introducing yourself. It's like these are the things that we think about define us. I often see it in the conversation, the hairdresser, right? That casual conversation that has like those first few questions that seem to be the same few questions every time. I had an interesting experience at the barber this week. I've often gone to the guy here in Riverston, near the IGA there, and there's two guys there. One I've talked to a fair bit, Amar, the owner. I've talked to him a fair bit. The other guy that's been there the last few times, Samuel, I've never talked to him actually. I didn't think he spoke English I went to Stanhope Shops this week, and he was there as the hairdresser. And he spoke to me straight away. He's like, oh, come on in. And I was like, you speak English? And then we're sitting there, and he said, actually, at first I wasn't completely sure it was him. I was like, I'm pretty sure, but you've cut my hair before, but not here, and this is really tripping me out. And then he said, where do you normally get your hair cut? And I was like, at Riverston. He goes, I thought so. He probably thought, I didn't know you spoke English. And he was really chatty, and we kind of went through those initial conversations. And he showed me photos of his wedding. He got married 6 months ago, and he's showing me photos of his wedding and stuff like that. And he asked me this question. He said, do you have any sons? And he did have a thick accent, and I still don't know if it was English and he meant children. So I just said, I've got a boy and a girl, and we talked about that. And I said, do you have any children? And he said, this is before we had the conversation about just getting married, he said, no, I don't have any sons. And I just thought it was interesting. I was processing that, and I was saying, is this a cultural thing, that an identity in having sons as Father's Day comes up? Is it an English thing that he means children generally, and he just used the word son? I don't know, but people do have different kind of things we put our identity in, our meaning. And there's dangers actually for us to be caught up in that, isn't there? Like we say, this is who I am. So Jesus wants to start, as he talks to his disciples, he wants to start with this message of who they are is in him. Their identity is in him. In fact, he uses this line that we read, that first line in John 15, I am the true vine. And for the disciples, we would expect that they understand the picture of the vineyard and the vine as an Old Testament image referring to God's people. So for the disciples, we would imagine, because fairly throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets, this image of a vineyard, we would expect that that's something that they would be familiar with. When Jesus says, I am the true vine, there's a shift there that's happening for the disciples. Because all the way through the Old Testament, this image of a vineyard has been used, but it's been talking about Israel is the vineyard, Israel is the vine. In fact, a great place to look for that, Isaiah chapter 5, often called the Song of the Vineyard, is this picture of Israel as the vineyard. All right, so for example, let me read a bit for you. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, right? Can't be much clearer than that. The people of Judah are the vines he delights in. That's the picture we're given. Except the problem with this vineyard, and we see this throughout the Old Testament, is the vines are not bringing the delight they should to God. So while Isaiah in this song says, the vines he delights in, the very next verse shows that the vineyard actually is not bringing that delight. This is what it says. He looked for justice. This is God looking at the vineyard. He looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. This is the picture. God's people are called the vineyard, and he should be delighting in them. But when he looks at Israel, he is not seeing the Israel he wants to delight in. And this is the message that we would imagine the disciples are actually quite familiar with the Old Testament prophets' teaching on the fact that the vineyard is not bringing delight to the Lord. In fact, we're working through Jeremiah in our regular sermon series, and we see it similarly in Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah 12, verse 10. Many shepherds will ruin my vineyard and trample down my field. They will turn my pleasant field into a desolate wasteland. All right, so this is the picture. So here's what Jesus says. They know they should be the vineyard that should bring delight to God. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and you are the branches. What Jesus is doing here is he's taking the weight of that responsibility of being the vineyard of God off them and putting it on him. The weight of, what did Isaiah 5 say? He looked for righteousness. The weight of righteousness. Jesus is telling his disciples, that is coming off you. That is going on me. I'm carrying that. Your identity, your position before God is made pleasing through me. That is that opening verse. I am the true vine. You are the branches. Jesus wants to transform their thinking on the vineyard to say he is the source. And that is good news for a group of disciples that over the next 3 days are going to scatter and flee and deny him and go in hiding. What a great message to them to say, I am the true vine. I am the source. I am the one that when God is looking at you, he sees me and finds you to be pleasing because of me. And it's good news for us as we think about the times that we take our identity and put it into other things, the things we turn away from God, to remember that our identity is in Jesus. It's good news for the father who feels like he's inadequate, who feels like things aren't working the way he should, or feels like he's not discipling his kids as well as he would like to. It's good news for the one who had an imperfect father and wonders, am I destined to be this person, to grow up to be the same as him? The one who has a father that is a lousy father and their identity is caught up in that. It's good news for the one who has a great father and says, I can never live up to him. He is just so amazing and I can never be that person. Jesus wants to say, don't put your identity in those things. Your identity needs to be in me. And it's good news for all followers. No matter what we're putting our identity in, no matter what we are wrestling with in that regard, that we're not worthy, Jesus wants to say, no, you are found pleasing to God because of me. If we are in Christ, we are made pleasing to God because of Jesus. I heard a pastor, Jamin Roller from Village Church in the States, say it like this. He says, if you want to live an exhausting, doubt-filled, anxiety-filled life, doesn't sound like something anyone wants. If you want to live that, then go ahead and live your life as if your practice determines your position before God. Because if you live your life as if your practice determines your position before God, every time you fail, every time you're not good enough, every time you do the wrong thing, you just lose your focus on being one of God's children. Jesus starts with this. This is our starting place. Our identity, our position is made pleasing before God because of Jesus. And our position defines our purpose. Our position before God calls us to a purpose in him. Once again, like identity, things can drag us away and distract us. Purpose is wrapped up in that, isn't it? What am I doing? What am I trying to achieve in life? Am I successfully achieving it? Are people seeing that I'm successfully achieving it? Or, the relationships in my life. Maybe there's things in your life that you think are distracting you. You're trying to drive your purpose towards those things. They can distract us from God. Jesus wants to say your position is in him, and that calls us to a purpose that is eternal. We see it really clearly at the end. So we start at the start, where Jesus starts at purpose, at position, and he finishes out bringing us to purpose. Verse 16, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that, this is the purpose, so that you might go and bear fruit. Fruit that will last. Jesus is saying your purpose is to bear this eternal fruit. What is the fruit that Jesus is talking about? There's a danger here actually that we get kind of jumped straight to. The fruit is conversions. When he says go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, there's a danger we kind of jump straight into the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples, and we assume that's what he's talking about as fruit. I think that is secondary to what he's talking about. That's an indirect kind of fruit that he's talking about. I think the direct fruit he's talking about much more is core internal life of Jesus flowing in you. Let me take you back to Isaiah 5 again, this picture of a vineyard. What is it that God was looking at the vineyard for? What is the fruit? As God looked at the vineyard in Isaiah 5, what is the fruit he was looking for? We were told he looked for justice. He looked for righteousness. That is the fruit that God was looking for as he looked for the vineyard. He's looking for his life flowing through that vineyard. He is looking for the life of Jesus flowing through his disciples. That is the fruit. I mean, we use that, we hear Paul use that language in other letters he writes to the church. Well, the fruit of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience. I think that's the same fruit that Jesus is talking about in this case as he talks about go and bear fruit. Your purpose is to be transformed and be more like Jesus. And what happens in that as you live a life of glorifying him and being transformed by him, that flows out of us as we share Jesus' life flows from us to others. And that is where we might see the indirect fruit, where God is using us to bring life to others. But we have this purpose to bear fruit here in John 15, and the purpose, the fruit is to be transformed, to be in the vine, to have the life of Jesus flowing through us. So we want that to be coming through us and pouring out of us. Our position before Jesus calls us to a purpose. And that is the fruit that will last, Jesus tells us. And as we think about how that flows out of us into the lives of others, I said it a few weeks ago that when we say one thing but do another, when we say I follow Jesus but I do another, we call that hypocrisy. Like when we are hypocrites, when we have hypocrisy, the fruit of hypocrisy is often seen predominantly in the spiritual impact of those around us. When we say, I follow Jesus to the people around us, but they see our lives and they think, I don't see Jesus flowing out of you, that impacts their perspective of Jesus. It impacts the gospel message on them. And so the fruit of hypocrisy in our lives is often the seeds of the spiritual lives of those we love. Particularly, we might think of people really close to us like our family, our children, that when we are not living a transformed life, when God is not transforming us, and we say we follow Jesus, but behind closed doors in the privacy of our house where our children can see us, we're not followers being transformed by Jesus. The impact, the fruit of that hypocrisy impacts the message of the gospel in their lives. The same thing is true in close friendships. The same thing is true in other family members that we have that can see us for who we really are. And when we are not being transformed by Jesus, that fruit impacts their lives. So Jesus called us to go and bear fruit. It's a fruit that transforms us, but it's a fruit that spills out over into the lives of those around us. Our position is made pleasing because of Jesus, but we are called to a purpose of bearing fruit, and that purpose shapes our practice. Jesus actually draws it really to a specific example of practice, to the example of prayer. We get this quite confusing passage actually on prayer in John 15, right? Jesus says those words, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. He continues and he says, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. We get this confusing thing where it's almost like this promise that everything you ask will be given to you. And it doesn't take long as a Christian to realise that is not the reality. Everything I ask of God, he doesn't give me. In fact, the weird thing about the passage is Jesus has had this image, we'll come to in a moment, of pruning the tree, which does not sound like a pleasant experience. It doesn't sound like they're getting everything they ask, and then a little while later he's saying, but whatever you ask, you'll get in my name. What is he talking about here? He's talking about being transformed by our purpose that impacts our practice, not the other way around. Work with me for a moment as we look at this. It's kind of surprising the way Jesus words this. He says, his logic is, I chose you, I appointed you, that you might bear fruit. So he appointed us so we would bear fruit. That's our purpose. We would bear fruit so that our prayers would be answered. That's his logic here. We bear fruit so that our prayers will be answered. What's weird is we would kind of, even as a kind of mature Christian thinking, we would expect it the other way around. We would say, surely it'd be a great idea that God answers my prayers so that I might bear more fruit. In fact, in our most godly moments, surely we're praying that God will answer our prayers so that we bear fruit. And while that is a reality of the partnership of prayer, Jesus' point here is actually the opposite. Jesus' point here is we are called to bear fruit, to be transformed to be more like Jesus. And when we are transformed to be more like Jesus, it transforms our prayers to point them to God's purpose. And when our prayers are pointed to God's purpose, he is working through us. And so that's the picture we get here. Not that our prayers are answered so we'll be more fruitful, but as we are transformed by being fruitful, our prayers are also transformed. Our purpose changes our practice. John Piper says it like this. He says, if you are not devoted to fruit bearing, you have no warrant for expecting answers for prayer. Prayer is designed for fruit bearing. And so when we are immersed in God's purpose, when he is transforming us, and our prayers align with his purpose, God partners through his people with prayer. Our position calls us to a purpose. Our purpose transforms our practice. We bear fruit. So the question is, how do we bear more fruit? Let me finish with two things. We bear fruit through the Father pruning, and we bear fruit through remaining in Jesus. That's very clearly Jesus' message here. We bear fruit through the Father pruning. There's actually two pictures we get here. One is cutting off and one is pruning, right? Verse 2, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it might be even more fruitful. Two pictures, cutting off. There's actually a really tangible example of that happening right as Jesus speaks. Right as Jesus speaks, Judas is heading off. They've already had the Last Supper. Jesus has already sent him out the door. He's heading off to the religious leaders to betray Jesus. So that is happening over here, and Jesus is telling his disciples, there are some that are not going to be in me. And those that are not in me have no part of me. And they are to be cut off and removed. But there's a different story for those that are in the vine, remain in the vine. There's a different story for those disciples that Jesus is talking to, but there's still a cutting that's going to happen, Jesus says. This one is not a cutting off. This one is a pruning. I really love the illustration of Jesus, of the Father as a gardener and pruning, because I feel like it really well depicts what Christian life feels like sometimes. The idea that this painful process is bringing rejuvenated life. When I was a kid, I lived on a kind of combined property, and we had a tree. It was kind of between the properties, but it was more on the neighbour's side, a mulberry tree. And it was not a huge tree. It was big enough to climb in, and it was bushy enough most of the year round to hide in. And we hadn't kind of built a tree house in there, but we used to play in there a lot. Every winter, the neighbour would trim the tree. He would it felt like he would butcher the tree every winter. Like he would just carve it back to a stump. Like you got this like semi kind of treehouse thing happening where you can go in there and disappear from the world, and then he just, and it's just like there's nowhere to hide anymore. It just totally ruined it. I even remember my mum saying once, like, "Oh, I really don't like the way he does that. It's so ugly." A couple of years ago, we got a mulberry tree in our backyard. And turns out, in winter, whether you cut its leaves or not, a mulberry tree drops all its leaves, right? Actually, a mulberry tree looks reasonably ugly during winter. In fact, it wasn't the neighbour that was making it look ugly. It actually kind of just drops all its leaves and it becomes this spindly. There was never going to be a place for me to hide in it in the winter. And I never realised that. And what was actually happening there was not him butchering a tree because he just, was brutal in his way he was managing this tree's growth. But he was pruning it so that it would stay healthy, so that it would have another season. And every year it did. And every year I enjoyed the way that it was so bushy and thick and we could hide in it. And the truth is that probably was the case because he was pruning it. And I think it's such a helpful illustration for us to think about what Christian life looks like. Because so often God is working through us in what feels like a painful, feels like even an ugly time where you're thinking, where is the life? What is God doing? But it is in those times, and Jesus is telling us that it is in those times that he is making us more fruitful. And the reality is, I think we often look back on times in our life and you think about the times where you really feel like God drew you closer to him. Most often, perhaps maybe even all the time, you look back on the more difficult times. It's rare, actually, we look back on the cruisy times or the times of great blessing that we think, oh yeah, God was really teaching me something then. It's almost always the times that were difficult, the times that were pruning. And I think it's a helpful image for us to see when we are particularly wrestling with those times, to know maybe it feels like things are really ugly. Maybe it's hard to see what God is doing, but we want to trust in the promise Jesus has told us, which is those are in the vine, get pruned, God works on them. In fact, I heard a preacher, Kent Hughes, say this. He drew the illustration this way. He said, the hand of the gardener is never closer than when the pruning takes place. The reality for us is we feel at those times often like that is when God is distant from us. And more often it is when God is working through us, transforming us. I think it's this wonderful picture, as painful as the picture is. There is a joy and a hope that comes in that picture. And when we look back and we see those times that God drew us closer, and we may even get to a place, hopefully, that we can praise God for the way he drew us. And maybe we left in a place where we say, it's great that God drew me closer to him, but I wish he did it another way. Sure, but he did it and he drew us closer to him, and that's the way he's working through us, transforming us to be more like him. So how do we be more fruitful? God is doing it in us. But there's also a responsibility on us, Jesus says. He says, remain in me as I remain in you. There is this partnership that is happening there. That we cling to him as he works in us. And so we want to take that encouragement as well. That not only we are confident God is working in us even in the difficult times, even when we can't see him, but we need to work at pursuing him. We are made pleasing to God because of our position in Jesus, but it impacts our practice, and we want to be, it drives our purpose, which transforms our practice, and we want to be seeking him. And I want to encourage you this morning as you think about what remaining in Jesus looks like for you. And maybe there's some things in your life you need to work harder at, spending time with him, figuring out how you better align your lives with Jesus. But we are called to that purpose, to be fruit-bearing. And so we want to be transformed from the inside out. And in turn, that flows out into the rest of our lives. So let me finish with that encouragement. Our position before God is in Jesus. It transforms our purpose, which shapes our practice. So we want to finish with that encouragement to work at remaining in Jesus, to work at abiding in fellowship with him, to spend time in his word, to spend time in prayer, to spend time serving him in our lives, that we might live to our purpose, which is to bear fruit. The transforming work of Jesus that flows up out of our lives into the lives around us. Let me finish by praying. Father God, we thank you that you are the life giver. We thank you that you sent Jesus, that the weight of responsibility of our righteousness might be laid on him, that while we know we often fail you, we have been made pleasing in your eyes because the salvation of Jesus. We pray that that position before you might impact our purpose and shape our practice, that we might cling to you as we are confident you cling to us. In your name.